guys, it's Nikki here. I'm here today to do my February book of the month review. As normal, I'm doing my spoiler-free front half, spoiler-filled back half, and the book I'm talking about today is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. This is part of my Blind Date with Book subscription. They do not sponsor me in any way. I just really like the service, and I thought it was a good concept to do kind of a TBR-ish in-depth discussion video for. The story is about this house, and we view it from the perspective of Eleanor. She's one of 4 people, well, sort of 4 to 6 people there to study it over a period of time, and she has just come from a very odd situation, so she has a lot of things going on, and we spend a lot of time in her mind, and they give us a really, found it gave a very interesting perspective. Because it's a horror novel, predictably weird, creepy things start happening all over the house with really strange supernatural kind of connotations, and with that I will launch into my likes and dislikes. My likes include the very creepy tone that the novel had. I was never really super scared, but I really appreciated the way that tension and the kind of creepiness were built up with what the characters were experiencing and how the house itself was described. My second like is how kind of weird and eccentric the characters were. They did a really good job of having very different people, but all be like flawed and just eccentric. I really don't know how else to say it. They were mostly likable. They were a little static, with the exception of Eleanor, who had the most growth because we were seeing so much going on inside her head. But it was just a really interesting cast of characters. They were a lot of fun to kind of learn about and meet. And this leads me to my third positive, that is the fact that we follow Eleanor. Like I said, she did come from kind of an odd situation back home before she came to do the study with Dr. Montague and the other 2. However, just her perspective and her shelteredness, I found, lent a really interesting air of vulnerability to her perspective, and there was an innocence to some of what was going on because of it. I particularly enjoyed it because there was a lot of growth and development in what she was doing and what she was thinking. And that's all I have for my likes. Moving on to my dislikes. My first dislike was the pacing. The pacing made me feel disconnected from parts of the story because you'd have such a slow build to the tension, and then when you got to kind of like the haunting actions, I found it was really rushed compared to the tension building, and the pacing just didn't really agree with the tone all the time, and that did pull me out of my experience of the book. My second negative is that the haunting actions, just the way they were written, I felt like they didn't always flow well with the build up to them, and the release of tension with each action was a little bit iffy, like whether or not it happened and how the tension built leading up to them didn't always agree with the final outcome. It's just not something I particularly enjoyed. My third negative is a little bit more specific. It is the character, Mrs. Montague. I think we could have just done without her. That's really all there is to say. I just didn't care for her. And that's it for my dislikes. I'll move forward with the characters. I'm mostly going to talk about Eleanor here. Like I've mentioned a couple times now, she comes from kind of a strange-ish home life with her sister and her family. And she used to be a full-time caregiver. You learn that pretty early on, so it's not really a spoiler. And that also affects her perspective and her outlook. There's something about her that made her a really good pick to be the perspective that the narration is coming from, that made her a good pick for the narrative being from her perspective. I don't think the book would have been as effective if it had been from anybody else's point of view. This leads me to Luke, at least I think that's Luke, Theodora, and Dr. Montague. They've round out the group of 4 that's really there to study the house over the course of the summer. Theodora is kind of flighty and bubbly and friendly, but she always seems to have kind of like these brittle undertones in some of her interactions. You have Luke, who's kind of carefree, but you find out that there's some other things that his family's concerned about in regards to him, so they're hoping that being with these people and doing this study will help straighten him out. And then you have Dr. Montague. I think the book does him probably the most justice of the side characters. You get the idea that he is a very intelligent man, but you also get the idea that he is very focused on the supernatural world and how to study it. The introduction is from his perspective, and I think it does a very good job of exemplifying what kind of character he is, because he does seem to be kind of a really interesting mixture of superstitious, intelligent, and just like silly combinations of the two. He was really interesting to get a perspective from as well. And with these side characters, I know they're all flawed, they're all pretty intriguing. The only complaint I really had about them is that they were kind of static. They didn't seem to grow the same way that Eleanor grew, but that could just be because of how the perspective was used. And that's really all I have to say about the spoiler-free portion. I'm going to give you my quick wrap up for the spoiler-free part and give you the rating I gave the book as well. The rating I kind of landed on was 3.5 out of 5. It was good, and I would probably reread it at some point, which is kind of what that 3.5 means to me. But I don't know if I'd pick it up right away. The book overall was pretty good. I liked the tone, I liked the atmosphere, even though it was at odds with the pacing sometimes. The writing itself was pretty accessible, and it lent itself well to Eleanor's particular perspective and the way the house was described. And it made it feel very easy to kind of immerse yourself and get an idea of what this house and what the atmosphere really felt like to the people involved, and I really enjoyed that part. But like I said, the pacing and the way some of the haunting portions were done, that part just pulled me out of the book enough that I didn't enjoy my experience as much as I would have liked to, and as much as I hoped I would based on the first few chapters. I will give you guys a spoiler warning. Everything that I do after this will be spoiler filled. I'm doing book club questions and kind of a spoiler chat, so if you are wanting to read the book and not be spoiled, click off the video now. If not, stay tuned. Alright, so I am doing my usual 6 book club questions. The first one is, what was your initial reaction? I was incredibly intrigued by the beginning of this book. Just the way that the house was described, the situation was described, and the kind of people that Dr. Montague was reaching out to really grabbed my attention, and I thought that kind of cast would be really interesting to watch. My second one is, what is your favorite chapter or scene? One scene that really stuck out to me, it kind of felt like the turning point for a lot of Eleanor's development, and that was where she and Theodora are sharing a room for the night, and she is thinking that she's holding Theodora's hand, and all of this stuff is happening, and in the room and in the hallway outside of the room, and then something happens and she realizes that Theodora isn't actually the hand she's holding. Theodora does something and moves, and she realizes that that's not, it wasn't who she thought it was, and that's kind of where I really felt like Eleanor's reality was beginning to change, and I felt it was just a really impactful moment in the book. 3, how did the characters change throughout? Like I mentioned, most of the characters were pretty static. There wasn't a lot of development within them, the exception being Eleanor, and her development and growth was really interesting in that it was a lot of what her reality was and how the house was impacting her, and it made for a really interesting perspective and a really interesting narrative. Question 4. How do you feel about the ending? I feel kind of meh about the ending. I've read much worse endings, and I've read much better endings. The tension build up to right before the ending was really good, and the inciting event was really interesting. The sense of unreality that you got from Eleanor's perspective at the ending made the ending feel not quite as satisfying as it could have, but overall it wasn't that bad. Question 5, would you read more books by this author? I know this book was written a long time ago, and I didn't think to research to see if she'd done anything else beforehand, but I would definitely read something by this author again, especially if it's horror based. I think she did a really good job, and even though this wasn't the most amazing book I've ever read, it was definitely enough to keep me intrigued all the way through. And then question 6. Are there any other books that you've read that remind you of this book? For me personally, no. But that has to do more with the fact that I haven't read a lot of horror novels recently. The most recent horror novels I've read were from Stephen King, and although the tone is very similar, most of the stories are pretty different. If you guys have any suggestions, if you've read this and have some other books that you would maybe suggest, leave them below in the comment and I will see if I can find them and read them if I have time. And with that, I will move on to the spoiler chat. The first thing I want to talk about is something that I'm sure a lot of people picked up on pretty quickly. It was telegraphed really nicely. There wasn't a lot of hand-holding, but the fact that you could pretty quickly pick up on the fact that it was the people there studying the house for hauntings started to really mirror the interactions of the family that lived there originally. The biggest things for me were how Theodora and Eleanor went from acting like new acquaintances to kind of having a sister relationship, that kind of complex one where you get a little bit of fighting, a little bit of joy, but just like lots of chatting and interaction. And then the wording that was used specifically between the two of them when they were talking about Luke and their interactions with him and how they feel about him. And it was very interesting to see it circle around like that. The second thing I kind of want to talk about is I wish there was more with the hauntings. Like, I appreciated that you weren't quite sure what was going on, but I would have liked more of the hauntings to have resulted in like a haunting action, like the banging on the doors or the coldness or the doors constantly closing, but have it not break tension every time. Because I feel like that extra build up just to a bigger climax would have been kind of nice, but it's pretty minor. It's just something that I wanted to talk about because it was very strange that every time something happened, like the banging or the attack in Theodora's room where her clothes and stuff were wrecked, it really would have been nice had that just continued to build tension rather than breaking it every time. And then the final thing I kind of wanted to talk about is how well the house set the scene. I know I mentioned it kind of vaguely in the likes, but the way the house is described as like a labyrinth and confusing and just like built to put you off center, I found really, it just did a really good job helping with the atmosphere and the tone and just adding to the general confusion of what was going on, which was really off-putting for the characters, but really interesting to me as a reader anyways. The other thing I really liked is just like the darkness and kind of dankness and like feeling of neglect despite the house being taken care of every day. Like, yes, because she was, I think it was because the caretakers were only there during the day, like, yes, the housekeeper couldn't get to every room every day, but the fact that the house was so well maintained by these people really made the house seem extra creepy because there was all this leftover like mustiness and darkness, and I really enjoyed the way that the setting was described because it was so atmospheric. And that's all I have to say. So I will see you guys in the next video. See ya!